Green consumerism is the collection of efforts by environmental NGOs, businesses and governments to persuade individuals to buy goods and services that are less harmful to the natural environment through their production, consumption and disposal. The consumption of green consumer goods has itself become a method of self-creation through the consumption process. I always reflect on this whenever I go to a shop like Kathmandu. While its motives may be laudable, the danger of green consumerism is that it brings about the privatisation of responsibility for environmental degradation. Instead of being understood as a set of problems endemic to our economic and social structures, we're told implicitly or very often explicitly that we each have to take responsibility for our own personal contribution to each environmental problem. This assignment of individual responsibilities is, of course, consistent with the free market view of the world. I remember many years ago in the late 80s when I was working at the Resource Assessment Commission, not long before I set up the Australia Institute, the right-wing think tanks, the prominent ones at the time, the IPA and the Tasman Institute, used to take a so-called free market approach to environmentalism. And in the case of forestry, they argued, in all seriousness, that to solve the problem of old-growth logging, the appropriate response would be to carve up all of the high-growth conservation areas into small blocks and auction them. And if environmentalists were genuinely concerned about the destructive impact of old-growth logging, then they would go and buy a block of forest and preserve it. And if they don't buy it, then they don't really care. In practice, green consumerism has failed to induce the significant inroads into the unsustainable nature of consumption and production. For example, in those countries where green power, renewable electricity, has been made available to households and businesses, the take-up rates have been very disappointing, despite very substantial marketing efforts by private companies and government and a sustained public campaign. The take-up rate for green power in Australia is no more than around 7%. And despite the fanfare, buying carbon credits has to date had no appreciable impact on the growth of greenhouse gases, nor is it likely to. The trend to individualise environmental problems has far-reaching implications for the nature of democracy as well as environmental progress. When environmental problems become individual responsibilities, the nature of public debate is transformed. It's no longer about the institutions that perpetuate and reinforce environmental degradation. It's about our personal behaviour. When citizens concerned about the environment are told to express that concern through their purchasing decisions, social conscience becomes a commodity. The ethical conversation is also changed. Instead of understanding the structural factors that are the cause of and the solution to environmental problems, it becomes a question of personal morality, in which each of us is assigned a place on a sort of moral scale with moral purity at one end and environmental irresponsibility at the other. In this way, we're encouraged or shamed into buying eco-friendly products, insulating our homes and recycling our waste. Websites that allow us to calculate our own ecological footprint tend to reinforce this personalising of responsibility. While these activities, of course, don't deserve to be criticised in themselves, I'm sure many of us here, including myself, undertake these things, when they're promoted as the solution to environmental decline, they may actually block the real solutions. As the US analyst Michael Maniatis has written, a privatisation and individualisation of responsibility for environmental problems shifts blame from state elites and powerful producer groups to more amorphous culprits like human nature or all of us. The environment becomes depoliticised so that the major political parties can share a common vision without getting into a potentially damaging bidding war over who will better look after the environment. While advanced as a way of harnessing the power of consumers, green consumerism actually disempowers us because it denies us our agency as citizens instead of consumers. And it's important to stress that the failure of consumers to take up green power or to engage in sufficient recycling does not mean that they don't care about the environment and that nothing should be done. That argument confuses the role of the self-interested consumer with the role of the responsible citizen. Despite attempts to turn us all into rational economic calculators, consumers are not the same as citizens. Supermarket behaviour is not the same as ballot box behaviour. There's a wealth of evidence to show that people think and act quite differently in the two roles. So it's not inconsistent for consumers to decline to take up green power when it's offered, but to vote for a party that promises to require everyone to use green power. The obstacles to a new politics of sustainability should, as a result of this analysis, not be underestimated. Environmentalists have long recognised how difficult it is to persuade people to change entrenched consumption habits. Consumption behaviour and the sense of personal identity are now so closely related that a challenge to someone's consumption behaviour is a challenge to their very sense of self. In my contribution to Dear Mr. Rudd, edited by Robert Mann, I argued that the most difficult task facing the Rudd government in following through in its commitments to reduce Australia's greenhouse gas emissions would be to persuade the Australian public that large energy price rises are inescapable. The task will take several years, I suggested, and should occupy some of the government's best minds. The Prime Minister should try to reach a bipartisan agreement on the issue, I said, because nothing would be more damaging to attempts to cut the nation's greenhouse gas emissions than an opposition going into the next election running on a populist pledge to cut petrol prices. Well, it took only a couple of months for my worst fears to be realised. The frenzy over rising petrol prices of the last several weeks and the opposition's promise to cut fuel taxes is a disastrous development, suggesting that it may take another decade or more before the Australian public is truly willing to accept the need to make significant changes to their consumption practices in order to significantly reduce Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. The petrol price panic has shown a severe lack of understanding of climate change and its remedies among the general public, and it shows the tenuousness of both major parties' commitment to action consonant with the scale of the problem. The turn of events reflects the strange, almost neurotic preoccupation of the public with petrol prices. As one or two analysts have pointed out, if petrol is excluded from the emissions trading system, then it will simply mean that the prices of other energy-intensive goods will go up, not by the same amount, but by more. So if petrol is excluded, people will be worse off. Green moralising and appeals to rational self-interest have taken us as far as they can. I'm arguing that most people would sooner consume themselves to death than risk killing off the self they know. The argument that I'm making can be further illustrated with reference to the phenomenon known as wasteful consumption. Although our desire might have no bounds, our capacity to use things is limited. An Australian study carried out by me and colleagues at the Australia Institute revealed that virtually all households buy many things that they never use. They often don't come out of the shopping bag. Food, clothes, shoes, CDs, books, exercise bikes, cosmetics, kitchen utensils, and much more. They admit Australian households to spending a total of $10.5 billion each year, or around $1,200 per household, on things they never use, more incidentally than total government spending on universities or roads. These numbers are actually underestimates of the extent of wasteful consumption in Australia, because they don't take account of major items that on which we spend for no purpose, such as houses that are much bigger than we can possibly use. So many houses have rooms that aren't used at all or only occasionally, but which nevertheless have to be carpeted, furnished, heated, cooled, and so on. And nor does it take account of holiday homes, for instance, that are never used, or cars that rarely leave the garage. So you could at least double that figure, I'd suggest. The problem of wasteful consumption as we become wealthier will, of course, worsen. The study also revealed that richer households waste more than low-income households or households on moderate incomes, which is what you would expect. But perhaps an interesting observation that only occurred to me the other day, another result from the study contradicts the idea of a so-called environmental Kuznets curve, which is the idea or the hypothesis that above a certain threshold, as people's per capita incomes rise, their concern for the environment and desire to protect the environment increases. But according to this survey, when people are asked whether they feel guilty about buying things that they never use, wealthy people, turns out, feel less guilty about spending money on things they don't use than poorer people. In other words, as people become wealthier, on this measure at least, they're less concerned about their environmentally destructive activities. Well, with this depressing story, is there a solution? Are we in the rich countries of the world capable of making the transition to a consciousness in harmony with sustainability? Well, the glib answer is we just must. We have to. But such an environmental imperative must, I've suggested, conquer a more powerful force. As I've argued, in a modern consumer capitalism, consumption is no longer aimed at meeting material needs, but at reproducing ourselves psychologically. It's the primary means by which we create an identity and sustain a sense of self. If, in order to tackle climate change, we're asked to change the way we consume, then we're being asked to change who we are, to experience a sort of death. So firmly do we cling to our manufactured selves that we fear relinquishing them more than we fear the consequences of climate change. This helps to explain the chasm between the complacency of ordinary people and most politicians on the one hand, despite the huge increase in awareness over the last couple of years in this country. So that complacency on the one hand and the rising panic among climate scientists and clear-eyed environmentalists on the other. Where does this leave us? Well, in my view, it's not utopian to believe that citizens of the affluent West can be persuaded that there's a more authentic and fulfilling alternative to the consumer life. What's the basis for this? Well, I've intimated tonight that confronting consumers with the facts about environmental decline and expecting people to change their behaviour misconstrues the psychology of the modern individual. It's a mistake to assume that consumers, beyond a certain low threshold, will respond to the logic of the environmental message. Consumption decisions are not driven by reason. Certainly, advertisers abandoned that assumption a long time ago. This means that we have to challenge directly the association between consumption and identity formation. But there are signs that after 2 decades of intensifying consumption, many people are beginning to rebel. Consider the downshifting phenomenon. When asked in surveys whether over the last 10 years they had voluntarily changed their lives in ways that meant they earned less money, around 1/5 of adults in Britain, the United States and Australia say that they have made such a change. This figure, which excludes early retirees and women stopping to have babies, means that around 1/5 of the population have voluntarily decided to reduce their incomes and to consume less. Although symbolic of the reaction against intensified consumerism, downshifters and their cousins, the cultural creatives, are not, for the most part, motivated by philosophical concerns, but simply by a desire to get some balance back into their lives. They don't set out to green their consumption, but to reduce their attachment to consumption itself in pursuit of more time for their families, their health, and their passions. We should recognise the personal significance of choosing fulfilment over money and material things. The resolution of the downshifters to swim against the materialist tide often provokes puzzlement, disbelief, and anger from their peers, friends, and family members. The decision to make a change in the way they live their lives usually takes downshifters 2, 3, or more years of contemplation and reflection on the nature and direction of their lives as the disillusionment of their chosen path builds and sets in. This process of gradual disillusionment, according to the interviews that we've done with downshifters, this process often culminates in some sort of existential shift. In reflecting on their decision, downshifters often point to a precipitating event, such as the shock of finding out about an illness for themselves or a loved one or even a work colleague. The event might be an argument they have with someone at work or their spouse, or they may find themselves weeping in a corner for no apparent reason. This event, which can usually be located on a particular memorable day, generates a resolution to change. Changes in the patterns of living by downshifters also are very revealing. And we ask them, well, how did your life change? What did you do differently? They generally report that they pay much more attention to the food they eat, including more attention to food preparation at home and more attention to nutritious eating. They report consistently that they're more aware of their health and their physical state. And they also often report that they gain greater exposure to the natural environment. They report that they feel their lives are somehow more authentic and that they're living more in accord of who they really are. Downshifting and related phenomena suggest a radically different approach to achieving a shift in consciousness and political change. Instead of confronting consumers with the facts of environmental decline and thereby hoping, against all of the evidence, that rationality will prevail over the demands of self-creation, a more powerful approach is to ask people to reflect on whether their aspirational lifestyles actually makes them feel contented and fulfilled. To finish then, the evidence indicates that many people are open to a conversation about the quality of their lives and the role of materialism in them. Most people believe that a radical change in values in society is needed, and they would prefer to have a less materialistic and less individualistic society. The surveys consistently show this. The translation of these concerns into political action may prove a far more effective way of stimulating an ecological consciousness than pointing to the dire material consequences of failing to respect the natural world. Thank you.